Okay, well, one of the things I was thinking about, because today is February the 22nd, and the next slide will show you, it's my birthday tribute to George Washington, our first president, but also our patron for the American Revolution, the leader of all our Patriot forces. Will that advance, you think, Jennifer?
Oh, sorry.
Oh, no, you're fine. Yay. So today is George Washington's birthday. Now, when I was a little girl, we actually celebrated Washington's birthday and Lincoln's birthday in our classrooms, February 12th, February 22nd. So you'll see that Washington was born February the 2nd of 1732. So he is approaching being a really, really, really old man. We'll be celebrating certainly his 300th birthday just shortly after we celebrate the 250th anniversary of the founding of the nation with the Declaration of Independence and the fight for our freedom. So I got to thinking about what topic we would do today when I was laying out the spring syllabus, and I thought, let's talk about some of those forgotten patriots that were participants in the American Revolution, to whom we owe our freedom in no small part, and yet who have, for the most part, remained nameless or at least unknown. And it's sort of a combination of both. So I'm going to move on to the next slide, and we're going to try and move through a bunch of folks relatively quickly. If I have, when we talk about the American Revolution and we talk about women in the American Revolution, I think most people think always first of Abigail Adams, because Abigail Adams is such a strong and independent woman, well-educated, well-read, reading Greek and Latin, having studied with her brothers, having been raised in a family where education, and because of her father being a minister and a patriot, is such a strong suit, that we all have this image of Abigail Adams writing letters back and forth to John Adams while he is off at the Declaration of Independence, writing Second Continental Congress. And then again, as he is back and forth as a patriot during the American Revolution as our ambassador to Great Britain, and then, of course, will be a part of the process of negotiating even the peace treaty in 1783, we have the advantage of having a lot of Abigail's letters. So we know her strong feelings on independence, and we understand the influence that she had on John, but also the influence that she ultimately has in her role as First Lady. Okay, I have a child with me and I was sending her back to bed. I have to tell you that as much as I love Abigail Adams, Mercy Otis Warren is one of my favorite women from the American Revolution. Not that she ever takes arms, but she takes arms in a way that has just as much impact as if she had been Molly Pitcher, or she had been Deborah Sampson, or some of the women who distinguished themselves on the actual battlefield. Now, Mercy Otis Warren is one of the few women who got actively involved politically, even as a young age. She's a poet, she's a playwright, she's a pamphleteer. She is the leading female philosopher of the American Revolution, and I've always been intrigued by her. She's from a large family, 13 children. Her father, James Otis, is a colonel during the American Revolution. He had served in the Massachusetts State Assembly, Colonial Assembly. He had been a participant in the French and Indian War. But it's interesting, Mercy, along with her brother James Otis, and you may recognize his name because James Otis is the author of a series of letters that will also sort of propel the American colonies toward the War for Independence. He is the author of Letters from a Pennsylvania Farmer. So Mercy Otis Warren and her brother James grow up very, very close. He's child number 1, she's child number 3 of 13. And they're very interested in current events. And apparently around the Otis dinner table at night, they debate political events. Now, Mercy grows up in this political atmosphere, having very strong opinions about political philosophy, about Enlightenment writers. She's read Locke, she's read Rousseau, she's read Montesquieu and others. And then she marries a man, merchant and farmer, who is also very actively involved in the Patriot cause. I think one of the things that I find so intriguing about Mercy is that once the war begins, she and her brother James, who is off serving in the Continental Line, they continue to exchange letters so that she can then share what he's seeing on the front lines of the battlefield with other people who are of interest about the course of the war. There is an attack that occurs early in the days, pre-Declaration of Independence, but early in the days of this revolutionary period. You'll remember that we began sort of the countdown of the revolution with 1763, when the British imposed the proclamation of 1763, and then they began to sort of levy all these series of taxes. Well, her brother James Otis ends up in an argument with a British commander in one of the pubs, and as a result, he is beaten pretty badly and ends up with brain damage. And because he can no longer be actively involved as this countdown to the revolution is going on, Mercy steps into his role, and she begins to chronicle what's going on in Boston, in Philadelphia, and she is very active in the letters, the correspondence committees that are writing between the 13 different colonies as to what's going on there. She becomes probably the most famous of those correspondents. Interestingly, she begins to then correspond with a number of those who will be propelled into prominence during the revolution. She and George Washington maintain an active correspondence even once George Washington goes into the battlefield. But she also simultaneously will be writing to Martha Washington when Martha is still at home on the plantation, and then once she joins George in camp. She's writing to both Abigail and John Adams. She's writing to Hannah Winthrop. She is corresponding with Patrick Henry because she feels like he has the best gauge for what's going on in the southern colonies. And it's interesting because in writing the letters, she is also keeping the letters that are sent to her. And as those who are receiving her letters begin to comment on the clarity with which she is able to assess and analyze what is happening around her, primarily in Boston, and with her husband's encouragement, she begins to author political pamphlets that can be handed out in public settings and distributed on the street. She's probably most famous for a pamphlet called The Blackheads, which comes out in 1776. She writes another one 3 years later that's called The Motley Assembly, and she's being critical in both of those pamphlets of individuals who are prominent in the community, but who are putting personal profit, personal fortune ahead of the concept of independence. And those individuals she sees touting their loyalist sympathies in contrast to what she believes is the future of the colonies, and that's independence. She will do this throughout the course of the American Revolution. When the war is over and the colonists have actually won, her career doesn't end. She begins to then publish plays, poems, and she publishes the most comprehensive history of the American Revolution. And it will be published during her lifetime, a 2-volume set in which she chronicles basically battle by battle, individuals who were prominent, documents that were significant, all of that history that is so important that we think of today in this, and it's called The History of the Rise, Progress, and Termination of the American Revolution. I think I would have probably said success of the American Revolution. But ultimately, the finished compiled history is published in 1805. And, it begins all the way back with the Stamp Acts and the Proclamation of 1763 and follows on up through the end of the Revolution. The other thing that's really important to remember about her that has little to do with the Revolution, but that I would love you to remember if you think of Mercy Otis Warren, is then when many of those same leaders are called together for the Constitutional Convention, obviously Mercy Otis Warren, even though she has been this chronicler of the Revolution, certainly is not given a seat at the table. but George Washington will preside over the Constitutional Assembly. She will maintain a correspondence with George Washington during that period, and Mercy Otis Warren will become one of the leaders of the Anti-Federalists. Not that she's not in support of the Constitution, but she will be lobbying actively those members who are in the Constitutional Convention, but also in the public press, the need for a Bill of Rights. She is concerned that if a Constitution does not include a Bill of Rights, how easily the argument of the day was, well, the rights of Englishmen are what we were fighting for. We all know what those rights are. Of course, those rights are going to be safeguarded. And Mercy Otis Warren is going to say, how easily those rights can be taken away from you by those who are in power if it serves their purpose to not recognize those rights. So she will really push for that, along with George Mason and some others push for that Bill of Rights. She actually lives until 1814, and she dies at her home in Plymouth, and she is buried at the Burial Hill Cemetery there outside of Boston. And I just always like to think of her as a woman of strong voice, probably typical of many other women of the period who were well educated, but simply didn't have the encouragement from family members to step forward and to articulate their ideas about independence. So Mercy Otis Warren, always a great one to think about when we think about that. And we'll go on to our next slide. And our next slide, you'll see I sort of have lumped together patriots of color. And the reason that I do that is because it's interesting. We know now, we've gone back through pension applications. We are now nationally in the archives, in the Daughters of the American Revolution, Sons of the American Revolution, those who have done research on the Patriots. We've gone back through each of the state legislative documents, colonial legislative documents that then transfer over once the United States is created, to begin to find notation in military records, pension application records, claims for property damage, all those sorts of things, to attempt to identify patriots of color. We know that in the very first engagement that occurs in April of 1775, there on the road to Concord and Lexington, that there were, the best we can tell from the archival notes, there were between 20 and 40 colonists engaged even in that very first action that were probably African American, Native American, and often there was a mixture of both. And although prior to the American Revolution, they were excluded from military service, once the American Revolution began, we have a number of individuals who will take up arms between 1775 and 1783. Interestingly, we have documented at this point about 5,500 African and Native American patriots who actually fought on the side of the colonists. There are also that many or more who fought on the side of the British, and you find that especially true as the fighting moved southward. Now, why do we not know so many of their names? Because at that point, their exploits were often simply recorded with a first name or with something that was descriptive of them. I do want to tell you about 2 or 3 of them. Chrysippus Attucks, you'll see in the slide over to the left, we recognize as being of mixed race. Those who were present at the Boston Massacre do not identify him as being African American, but they do identify him as being of color. And we assume that means that it was mixed race, African descent and Native American descent. But you'll see Prince Estabrook's tombstone there with the American flag, and you'll also see, you can't really distinguish what it is, but that's the Sons of the American Revolution medallion that's standing there next to it. What we know about Prince Estabrook is that he was an enslaved man who was listed in the census in the town of Lexington, Massachusetts in 1775, prior to the Revolution actually taking up arms and beginning to fight. But in April of that year, We do know that he stood on the town green along with his white neighbors as the British Army was marching through. And we know that he actually will take fire. He will be given weaponry and he will fire against the British, and he will actually be wounded himself in the shoulder. He recovers. He goes on to continue to serve throughout the course of the American Revolution, multiple deployments. He survives the war, and for such he is given his freedom. And so you'll notice that he is classified as being a member of the 3rd Massachusetts Regiment during the American Revolution. The person that you see kind of depicted at the top in the tri-corner hat is a depiction, because obviously if you were a person of color, and especially if you were an enslaved person, you were not likely to have a portrait of you. There might very well be a military sketch of you, but that person is identified as Cato Smith. He is a recognized American patriot. He was an enslaved African, is how he is noted, who came to the Massachusetts Bay Colony in 1761, and he was 10 years old at that point. And in 1775, he is enslaved to the family of Captain William Smith, who lives in Lincoln outside of the colony. And he will allow Cato Smith, give him his blessing, for Cato Smith to join the Massachusetts Army as a soldier. And he will serve into the end of 1775, Cato Smith will, and then he will re-enlist in the spring of 1776, and he will continue to serve in the Massachusetts area along with the Continental Line until he is killed actually in combat in 1775. Now, it's interesting when we think about so many of our patriots, that probably the first one really to get a lot of national recognition was recognized on a postage stamp several years ago, and that's Salem Poor. Salem Poor, also in Massachusetts. He began his life as a slave and ends his life as an American hero who is celebrated across the colonies. He was born also into bondage in the 1740s, but by the 1760s, he has saved up enough money by hiring himself out to buy his freedom for 27 pounds, which is a pretty significant amount of money. That would be several $1,000s today. And with the revolution beginning to ferment in 1775, Salem Poor enlists into the Continental Line. We know, according to the military records, that he was at the Battle of Saratoga. He was at Monmouth. He's most famous of all for his participation in the Battle of Bunker Hill, where the military dispatches document his exploits, so much so that 14 different missives that are sent back to command formally recognize Salem Poor for what is determined to be brave and gallant soldiery. There will be a petition made to the General Court in Massachusetts, and in it they recognize him for his bravery, saying that he served as an experienced officer. He's credited in the Battle of Bunker Hill with having killed the British Lieutenant Colonel James Abercrombie and several other enemy soldiers. Gotta get the Kleenex off my desk. Okay, and then probably the final one that I would mention to you is a guy by the name of Peter Salem. Several of them will take their names based on the location where they're living, and Peter Salem is best known for his critical contributions during the Revolution. Again, someone born into slavery, but becomes a Minuteman also at Lexington and Concord. And his owners were so impressed with his actions that they allowed him to enlist, and he will also stand alongside those patriots. So, you know, you look at the patriots of color and it's absolutely fascinating when you think about what they were able to do. So we'll move on to the next slide and look at some of our foreign contributors. Okay, now I have to tell you, in my early days of teaching, I always loved to talk about our Polish engineer friend who becomes such a recognized patriot during the American Revolution. And I have a feeling I probably crucified his name horribly during all those times that I talked about him. THADDEUS KOSCIUSKO is an engineer. He is a skilled engineer. Military education in his native Poland. He arrived in the United States in 1776. I love the fact that while he is fighting for the American revolutionaries, he is also dressed in the military costume of his native Poland. And there's a reason for that, and I'll explain that to you in a minute. He shows up here in the American colonies, and he offers himself as a person who wants to fight for American independence. Now, why would he do that? You know, he's grown up in Poland, primarily educated in Warsaw, but it's interesting. He had, as someone who is a child of the Enlightenment, he has read Jefferson's works. And in fact, he later said that when he read the Declaration of Independence in 1776, which is what propelled his involvement in the revolution, that he was so moved by Jefferson's writings that he burst into tears, and that he felt that the Declaration of Independence was the most perfectly constructed document in the history of mankind. He and Jefferson will later become very, very close friends, and they will actually correspond until Thaddeus's death. Interestingly, when he arrives here and he offers himself for service to the revolutionary cause, he will be the mastermind behind the colonial attack and the British defeat at Saratoga, because he understands the engineering strategies, the bulwarks, the redoubts, the things that will make that battle successful for the colonists. And then he will be the person who will oversee the building of the military fortifications at West Point. And that becomes especially important once we realize that Benedict Arnold has betrayed the logistics of that site to the British. When the war is over, one of the interesting twists in the story, when the war is over, he will return to Poland and will be involved in a Polish uprising against the Russians. The Poles, unfortunately, because they're in such a level, fertile plain in that northern part of Europe, have been the battleground for centuries between the Russians and the French, or the Russians and the Prussians, and the Poles have always been kind of caught in the middle of all of that. Well, he will be involved in an attempted uprising to overthrow Stanislav II, who is pro-Russian, but is the divine right constitutional monarch. And I say that with a slash. The Poles actually had an interesting sort of semi way of voting for their monarch, but their monarch is very pro-Russian. And so he'll be involved in an attempt to overthrow them. And as such, that attempted overthrow will not be successful. He will be imprisoned for a number of years. And once he is released, he will come back to the United States, and he will actually stay here for a period of time. Then he'll return to Europe, but never back to Poland. He will actually die in exile in Switzerland in 1817. One of the last letters he receives being a letter from Jefferson. By the time the American Revolution had ended, though, he had been by Washington recognized as a brigadier general and had received U.S. citizenship and a medal for his service. So, you know, he was a pretty instrumental outsider who came to our cause. The next person you see is Betsy Dowdy. And this is actually from the cover of a book that has become quite popular in the last few years about Betsy Dowdy's ride. Betsy Dowdy grew up on the north coast of North Carolina, along the Outer Banks, on a string of one of the islands. And as a child growing up there, she became quite a horsewoman. You know, those of you that are familiar with the Outer Banks know that there's a special breed of ponies that are called banker ponies, and they're not really ponies. They're just horses that are about 14 hands high or shorter. The belief is that they actually are sort of a mixture with some of the early Spanish horses that may have been shipwrecked along that area as Florida was being settled. But anyway, fall of 1775, there's a concern about what's going to happen in the South, and most of the reports going back to England from that area, the royal governor at that point in Virginia is a guy by the name of Lord Dunsmore. And Lord Dunsmore, while he had worn out his welcome in Virginia, he's going to retreat from Williamsburg sort of southward to Norfolk, and then he's going to try and head into the Carolinas. And he believes that if the British can take control of all the harbors in North and South Carolina, that the Southern colonies will never become actively engaged in this attempted overthrow of British authority. Interestingly, George Washington, of course, who is commander-in-chief of the Continental Army, sent out a missive that's basically carried by word of mouth through the different forces in the South that the future of the revolution depends on Dunsmore being crushed. And he actually, in a writing, sends a letter to the Continental Congress in which he says, I do not mean to dictate. I am sure that they will pardon me from having basically given them so much of a directive, but the fate of America and a great deal depends upon the obligation to get rid of Dunsmore. And so Dunsmore is aware that Washington has sort of put a bounty on his head, and he starts marching his troops southward. As he heads southward, as he gets into North Carolina, he destroys a number of houses. He sets up on the northern bank of the Great Bridge there in North Carolina. He is recruiting loyalists. He's recruiting slaves over to his side. He is sending troops out through the countryside, seizing provisions, destroying printing presses, all sorts of things that are going on there at Kemp's Landing as he's coming into North Carolina and across. Well, the atrocities become even more serious as he begins to move closer and closer to what today would be the side of the Outer Banks. The word goes out that he is moving his troops across that area, and that the colonial forces that are in that area of northern North Carolina simply are not strong enough to be able to repel Dunsmore and his troops if they come across the river. Betsy Dowdy is 16 years old, and she is in her household when there's a meeting that occurs among those who consider themselves to be patriots. And she's overhearing the story of what will happen if Dunsmore and his men keep moving south, burning homes, slaughtering livestock, killing people, the inhumanity, and the fact that the colonist effort is going to fail. And she overhears all of this, and no one really pays much attention to it. So the neighbors who are all gathered, they're reporting the fact that Patriot Robert Howe, who is a little bit farther south of where Betsy is located, that if he simply could get his forces there to join their local forces, together they might be able to stop Dunsmore, but they can't figure out how to get information to him because he's 50 miles away. And it's a rather treacherous ride. Neighbors leave, everybody's so upset. They see themselves being defeated in this conflict with Dunsmore's men. And Betsy Dowdy goes to bed, and she tosses and turns thinking about not only the fall of this attempted independence, but the slaughtering of the livestock, because she's pretty partial to those ponies, and what it will mean for her family. So she makes up her mind that she's going to get the word to General Skinner. She knows that the pony that she has raised is, according to legend, her pony is the fastest one on the island, and she figures if anybody can get to him by morning, she can. So she mounts Black Bess very quietly, comes downstairs, goes out to the barn, gets her horse, mounts him, and it's December, it's cold, and she heads out on that pony's back toward General Skinner's camp. Now, it's winter, She has to swim across the Sound to get back to the mainland. She has to ride through what is referred in history as the Great Dismal Swamp. She has to make it to Camden, and then she has to make it to Elizabeth City, and then she gallops all the way inland that 50 miles to get word to General Skinner, and she does that. And she is cold and exhausted when she finds him, but she tells him what's going to happen. Lord Dunsmore is what his plans are, and the general calls his men together. They march north to the Great Bridge, and they're just in time for the Battle of the Great Bridge, which is a little known, but a really important battle of the Revolutionary War that is successful all because of a 16-year-old girl. You know, we hear about Paul Revere's ride, we hear about, you know, Dr. Josiah Warren's ride, and a number of other rides that occur. Actually, there are a couple of other teenage girl rides that occur around Brandywine and up in that area. But so often in the South, we're just not real familiar with Betsy Dowdy's ride. Okay, next slide. Probably someone that you have heard of always, but I'm not sure that we always know exactly what it is that he does. And he is Prussian by birth. Prussia, remember that at the time of the American Revolution, there is no Germany. There are, at that point, 33 Germanic speaking provinces, everything from Hesse to Saxe-Coburg to, you know, Hohenzollern to Prussia, which is the largest, and Prussia, which of course is known. One of the sayings is that Prussia is controlled by its military, where in most countries, the military is controlled by the government. In Prussia, the military controls the government. So Baron von Steuben, let's talk about him for just a few moments. So he's born in 1730. So by the time the American Revolution comes around, he is in his mid-40s, but he has had sort of an interesting background. He has, by the age of 17, he is a Prussian officer. He actually joined the military at age 10. That's an interesting side note I'll mention to you at the end of our talk today. But he's an officer in the Prussian military, and by the age of 17, he is part of the infantry unit. He's a staff officer during the 7 Years' War on the continent, and becomes quite well known, so much so that he is assigned to Frederick the Great, who is the great emperor of the German Empire at that point. He's assigned to his headquarters. Frederick the Great envisioned himself to be a great military officer. He wasn't, but he enjoyed that role. And so he liked surrounding himself with a general staff of men who had distinguished themselves on the battlefield. Well, in the 1760s, while he's in his 30s or so, von Steuben, because he has made acquaintances at the king's court, will accompany one of the princes, one of the crown prince actually, to France, because the Prussians are in need of money. They want to build up their reserves so they can improve their army, because Russia on their eastern boundary appears to be a threat to them. While he is in France with his prince, von Steuben makes the acquaintance of Benjamin Franklin. Benjamin Franklin is going to be so important in so many of these things. And he learns that they will be raising an army in the colonies as time approaches. And so Steuben will come back to Paris in 1777, and he will be ordered. Benjamin Franklin will allow him to be reimbursed for his travel to the colonies, and he will become a part of the colonial forces. It's interesting. He starts out, he arrives in the colonies, and he starts out with a company of about 100 men. And one of the things that the officers around him notice very quickly on is that he appears to be a master of discipline. Apologies, I'm back. He will come to the attention of the officers. They recognize that there is a certain discipline in what he's doing, and they are impressed with what he's able to do. So he will be attached to General Washington while he is at Valley Forge. Not only will he then institute drilling maneuvers so that he is creating this sense of discipline, he will create a new method for firing that is much swifter. And that becomes critical because the truth of the matter is that person on the line who can load, fire, reload, the fastest is going to be the most successful. Weapons were not always accurate, but it was that speed and being able to do that. So he's going to be training the soldiers in those areas. He will also introduce sanitation to Valley Forge. And it's kind of interesting when you think about it. And I don't know that I had ever really looked deeply into this part of the military procedure, but prior to him being there and establishing these standards for sanitation for the camp layouts, what historically had happened was that soldiers relieved themselves wherever they happened to be. It's von Steuben who's going to introduce the idea of designated latrines. It is von Steuben who is going to lead them to the burning of human waste. It is von Steuben who's going to do things as simple as, when an animal dies, getting that animal out from where the soldiers are because of the danger of disease that can occur from even that. He will put together for the military something that will be known as the Regulations for the Order and Discipline of the Troops of the United States. It becomes the Military Blue Book. It will eventually apparently evolve into a Green Book, but it becomes the guide by which you're going to have troops trained. And it's this sense of order, understanding, recognizing hand signals, but also recognizing verbal orders. He will travel south. After Valley Forge, he travels south with Nathaniel Green. He will, for a period of time, be in Virginia, and he will actually be present at the Battle of Yorktown. Now, interestingly, von Steuben never returns to Prussia. He will be honored by the American government for his services during the Revolutionary War. They will designate that he receives a pension. He doesn't get it until 1790. So there's a long period of time there where he has very little money, but dear friends, Alexander Hamilton and some other friends will get him a loan so that he is able to live comfortably until he does receive his pension. He will purchase land in what today would be New York, and he will actually live there until he dies in 1794. So he has become sort of a part of our Revolutionary War lore. Most of us grew up probably hearing about von Steuben because I think we all grew up with the stories of Valley Forge and the horror of the winters. And we probably, heard about the women who in Philadelphia raised money and made shirts for the men and brought goods to them and everything. We probably have not heard very much about our next person that I'm going to mention. And that's because he was serving to the south of us. And yet he was in 2014 made an honorary citizen of the United States. A beautiful marker has been erected in his memory in New Orleans. And he's one of the people that I talk about a lot now when I talk with students, because we look back and we realize now it is, it was not just our patriot ancestors who were colonists here, but it was others who so very quickly picked up on that vision that Jefferson was able to articulate so well in the Declaration of Independence. And de Galvez is one of those people. Now, he was born in Spain, in Europe, studied military science, and very early on at the age of 16 will see active duty in a conflict between Spain and Portugal. And he will actually be serving in that as they invade Portugal. He will, for the decade and a half after that battle occurs in Europe, he will be involved in battles on both sides of the Atlantic. He will fight in Spain. He will come to come to what at that point is Spanish territory and what will become the United States. He will be fighting against Native Americans. He will be, he'll just be really actively engaged in the military and distinguishes himself there. Well, by 1777, he is in control. He is the Spanish governor of Louisiana, and he is in control of New Orleans. And when the United States begins their fight against the British, he will actively engage and support American troops through New Orleans before Spain ever makes their declaration. Spain doesn't declare war on Britain until 1779. But by then, de Galvez has already led a military campaign against the British. He has captured Pensacola, Mobile, Biloxi, Natchez, all of which had been British military ports along the coast or on the lower part of the Mississippi. And he did all of that really with only about, the best we can tell, 500 soldiers and 2 ships. But his greatest military accomplishment will be at Pensacola in Western Florida, and he will attack Pensacola by land and by sea. And it becomes one of the longest battles of the American Revolution. It goes on from that time for a period of a little over 2 months in 1781. And what's so significant about that is that the British, in thinking that they could quell the revolution in the South, their plans depended on being able to land troops there along the southern coast of the Gulf of Mexico and the Atlantic, and then those troops moving northward. Well, because de Galvez has taken control of that entire, what we today would think of from the Florida Panhandle all the way over to New Orleans, the British are not allowed, they can't land troops there. And as such, they will find themselves at Yorktown greatly understaffed and ultimately forced to surrender to Washington. I'm sorry. Looking at the clock, let's move real quickly and talk a little bit about a couple of guys that you're probably very familiar with their last names. And that's Casimir Pulaski and Johann de Kalb. If you look across the South, and I think it's always so much fun because I do it occasionally, and you look at the names of counties, or even in Louisiana provinces, you will find that in almost all of the southern states, there is a Pulaski, either as a town or a county, and there is a de Kalb. And yet the average citizen probably really doesn't know who those folks are and why they were important. So let's talk real quickly, first of all, about Pulaski. Now, Pulaski grew up as an aristocrat, and he is Polish also. However, he will not be as beloved by the American troops as was KOSCIUSKO. Pulaski was arrogant. He was overbearing. He is just really difficult to work with. But what he is very, very good at is he is great when it comes to military forces being on horseback. I'm going to grab a drink. Pulaski, I apologize. Pulaski also is one of those European one of those one more time. I guess I haven't been talking that much lately. Pulaski is also one of those European military leaders who is recruited to the American cause, again, by Benjamin Franklin. He meets Franklin in Paris in 1775 and receives a letter of endorsement from Franklin and comes to the American colonies, and he is anxious to get right into the fighting, and he does demonstrate a tremendous ability as a horseman, and he will become actually a member of Washington's staff, although Washington is not enamored with him because Pulaski doesn't tend to follow orders very well. but ultimately Pulaski will become known as the commander of the horse, and he is considered by many to be the father of the American cavalry. So that's his significance. And I'm going to move real quickly since we're about to run out of time. DeKalb. So DeKalb is an interesting person for us to think about. And we think about the American Revolution. Of course, here we have DeKalb County, not that far away from us. DeKalb is German, and he had actually trained in Prussia, but then he had become a member of the French. He had hired himself out. Now, he's kind of an interesting guy because he comes to the colonies during the American Revolution, and part of what he's here for is he is attempting to determine for the French how the American colonies feel about being under British control, how they feel about their relationship with Britain. So he is working with us, but at the same time, he's also sort of spying for the French to get an idea of whether if the French were to become involved with the American colonists, are the American colonists committed to actually fighting this war against Britain? Are they willing to go to the final degree? And DeKalb will, of course, send information back. DeKalb will be attached with Lafayette. They will meet in Charleston, South Carolina, then they will be in Philadelphia during the time of the Continental Congress. By 1777, DeKalb is a major general and he's on Washington's staff, but he also is sending information back to the French. And it is DeKalb who, as the war begins to move south, DeKalb will be ordered south, and he will take the Continental forces, the local militias in Maryland and Delaware both, and they will move to the south. They don't get to Charleston in time to save the fall of Charleston, but he and his troops will be engaged in all of those major battles that will happen in the Carolinas, and DeKalb actually will fall at the Battle of Camden. There's a monument on the field there at Camden to him, and Lafayette, when he came back to the American colonies, to the nation in 1825 and did that sort of ride of all the states, will stop at Camden and will actually dedicate that monument to Baron DeKalb. Final person that we'll do, and then maybe we can, if you have questions, we can talk about some other folks or even talk about them. We could do an entire class on each of these foreign leaders who become important to our military because they bring to us strengths that we had not historically used in fighting in the American colonies. And yet we have that innate fighting ability that came from the fact that so many of our soldiers are also frontiersmen and know how to fight. The last person who has a role in the American Revolution is interesting because Phyllis Wheatley is a poet. Phyllis Wheatley was born in Africa, we think around 1753, but she will be kidnapped and then she will be enslaved and sold into a family in Boston. But the family that she sold into in Boston educates her, teaches her to read and write, which in some areas was against the law, but Boston was a little more liberal. We know that by the age of 9, she is already reading English. She is familiar with Latin and Greek, and she is reading the classics. She's studying along with the family that she's brought into, the John Wheatley family, studying along with their children and their tutors. She begins writing poetry when she's only 13, and she takes as her inspiration, she wants to write like John Milton and Alexander Pope, neither of which are particularly simplistic poets. The style in which she wants to write is a pretty lofty style. In 1771, Phyllis Wheatley goes with the Wheatley's son, their eldest son, Nathaniel, to London on business. And while she's there, a number of her poems are circulated. She had gained some fame. She had written a poem a little earlier on the death of George Whitefield, who one of the early evangelical movers in that Great Awakening. And as she travels, she becomes quite a celebrity as she's traveling through London. People are intrigued with her take on what's going on in the colonies. Remember that she is there in 1771. So this is during that period of turbulation when the British Parliament is imposing tax after tax after tax. And, you know, there's this image in higher circles in London that pretty much everybody who's living in the American colonies, that we are all hillbillies and hicks and unwashed lower classes. And Phyllis Wheatley sort of takes them by storm, along with Nathaniel Wheatley, who is accompanying her, because she speaks so articulately, and she speaks of life in Boston on a level that's sort of intriguing to the people in London, because they don't see her as someone who is an enslaved person, is necessarily having the need to promote something that isn't true. By 1773, 39 of her poems have been published in London, and a book of her poetry has been published, and she has become quite the celebrity. Now, she and Nathaniel will return to Boston, and at the death of the Wheatley family, Phyllis Wheatley is freed, and she will marry and will have children. But in 1776, one of the things that Phyllis Wheatley does that sort of spurs a number of people of color, we believe, to join the revolutionary fight is that she writes a poem in which she praises George Washington. She is so happy to see, and these are her words, happy to see a person so favored by the muses to be in control of the forces that are going to lead the revolution. And part of that, if you read her poetry, if you read any of her other writings, any of the pamphlets and broadsides that she writes, one of the things that Phyllis Wheatley gives voice to is this dream of, certainly if you're a person of color, you're not free, and you're certainly not equal simply by being in the American colonies. But she believes in this dream that Jefferson has articulated, that she believes Washington represents. And you'll see that even this, the poem that I've included for you there on the screen on being brought from Africa to America. It was mercy brought me from my pagan land, taught by benighted soul to understand that there's a God, that there's a Savior too. Once our redemption neither sought nor knew, some view our sable race with scornful eye. Their color is a diabolical dye. Remember, Christians, Negroes black as Cain, may be refined and join the angelic train. So she becomes not only this poet of the American dream of possible equality, but also this voice of faith for redemption and the equality that being a part of the kingdom of heaven, and as she describes it in her poetry, is the true equality of all people. And in such, we believe, was able to convince many who might very well have fought for the loyalist people of color, instead to fight for the potential of what the future might offer. So I'm looking at the clock, it's 4:27. There are so many others that we could talk about. There are certainly many other women that we could talk about that we know now, from Prudence Warren to a number of others that I've talked about at different times when we've looked at the revolution. But what I always love to remind everyone is that from the very beginning, this nation is a tapestry of many different and varied colors, threads, and hues. And it is truly E Pluribus Unum. Out of the many comes the one. And it is that depth and that diversity and that rich history that makes us the nation we are today, and gives us hope that we will at some point in the future truly and completely fulfill the dream. You know, I'm one of those people that believes as long as we are broken and flawed individuals, there are always going to be some problems, but we certainly can move forward on the dream. So I'm excited that all of you are here today. and that we have, I was looking to see questions. Yes. Phyllis Wheatley is the first Black poet to be published in North America during that period, because she's published prior to the United States. She's published during that colonial period. And she is one of, we feel certain, the first 2 poets of any ethnic background to be published. And you read, I mean, I read the way that she writes, and to believe that she begins writing at 13, and this is the voice that she has. I'm absolutely in awe of Phyllis Wheatley. She remains one of those young women that I look at during the Revolution and just believe that there are certain among us that are designated with a voice to be able to share that sort of vision, to be able to share beauty. And she does it even as an enslaved person who doesn't have control of her destiny, but has her faith to sort of build as a bulwark around those things that are striking her in life. I mean, she's a fascinating individual. Thank you all so much for being here. And I guess, Jennifer, I'll turn it back over to you.
Okay, yes, thank you. That was really interesting today. And as you guessed, the imposing man in the slides that I was looking at before you started was the Prussian man, von Steuben. Yes, he looked very imposing in his uniform standing there. But I wanted to thank everybody for being here today. And next Tuesday, we will be covering an uncivil civil war. So that should be an interesting one as well. So we look forward to seeing everybody there. And thank you, Linda, for doing this for us. We really appreciate it. Okay.
I am so glad to. And one of the things we're going to do next week that I hope you all will find fascinating is we're going to look at the impact of the Civil War on our land and people in comparison to the French Revolution, which is a civil war, the Russian Revolution, which evolves into a civil war between the Red and the White armies. Oh, it's going to be so much fun.
Okay.